this is almost overwhelming for a seminar in the Cairns room with a completely full table. And I think it's a testament to our presenter today, the interest that her life and work brings to her discipline, but also to all of our lives as well. It is my pleasure to introduce Elizabeth, but most of you know who she is already. But I just wanted to mention her, her credentials. That she is a postdoctoral research fellow in Australian literature at the Roderick Centre for Australian Literature and Creative Writing. So most of you know about the Roderick Centre. It's established to foster an interest in Australian literature and also to foster research in Australian literature and creative writing. And Elizabeth hits all of those marks in terms of research and creative writing. You might not know that she's currently guest editor for Antipodes, the journal of the American Association for Australian Literary Studies. But I think we all know that she's just completed her research for a Queensland-Smithsonian Fellowship. If you're interested in the themes that Elizabeth covers, eco-criticism, Georgic studies, and literary representations of the Australian wet tropics. Before I pass over to Elizabeth, I mentioned to her this morning that because her slideshow's on my machine, I've had a quick look. And it reminded me of a work published almost 60, 70 years ago by the scholar of Victorian literature, Richard D. Altick, and it's called The Scholar Adventurers. And in that book, Richard Altick looks at all of those foundational scholars who did the initial archival research for a variety of different places. And I'll just read some of Ohio State University Press publishes this if you're interested, but I liked some of the blurbs from the publication, but also a bit of the description. I'll do the description first. Chaucer, Shakespeare, Wordsworth, Shelley, Keats, and many others surrender previously unrevealed secrets to these dogged researchers, of which we can welcome Elizabeth Smyth, whose ceaseless sleuthing has increased our knowledge and appreciation of both literature and the people who created it. So Elizabeth is working in that field, and some of these blurbs for the article also, I think, capture something of Elizabeth's spirit as a researcher. A careful, detailed, but by no means dull account of the more dignified pursuit of detection as practiced by literary scholars, we find there. Altick naturally enough plays up the glamour and romance of scholarly research, and its fascination for the scholar is transmitted to the reader. This is a volume of gracefully written essays celebrating the feats of literary detective work performed by scores of learned men and women passionately in love with the minutiae of literary scholarships. I hope you're still passionately in love with the minutiae of literary scholarships, Elizabeth, and I look forward to hearing about your adventures at the Smithsonian. Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks, Roger, for that warm welcome and introduction. And I'd like to thank everyone here today for making time to attend this presentation, and people online as well. I took this photo that you can see here of the National Museum of Natural History when I first arrived in Washington, D.C. And while I was there, 2 large bronze bison were added on either side of the stairs to mark the celebrations of the US independence. So it looks a little different now, but I'll show you a photo of those bison a bit later in the presentation. My aim today is to give you an overview of the Queensland-Smithsonian Fellowship program, along with some insight into the challenges faced by early career researchers. Then I'll offer aspects of my experience in DC before explaining the inspiration for my project, a few details of the project and my research process, and what I've achieved to date. So there'll be plenty of time for questions and discussion at the end, but let's begin.
I think I might just have to click in there. Now it should be right.
The Queensland-Smithsonian Fellowship is an arrangement whereby the Queensland government provides financial support for researchers to spend time at the Smithsonian for up to 16 weeks. And I applied for a 12-week fellowship, which meant a grant of $26,200. I made the 18,000-kilometre journey from North Queensland to DC, arriving unexpectedly via Chicago due to wild snowstorms in late January, and which meant I also lost my luggage for 3 days. Before then, though, I had to fly to Sydney to attend a visa interview because everything in Australia happens in the southeast, and I had to get a government-sponsored J1 visa for this. Now, this is some insight into the application process, started more than a year ago, and I've underlined my perilous employment journey because a requirement of the fellowship was that I would be employed, which is a challenge for all postdoctoral fellows or most early career researchers worldwide. Fortunately, I now have employment to 2029 due to the generosity of a trust and my university, and by gaining a short contract with the University of Melbourne. So for the Smithsonian Fellowship, which involved the Queensland Government, James Cook University, Margaret and Colin Roderick Trust, and the Smithsonian Institute, this meant a lot of administration and ultimately reporting to those 4 organisations shown in blue. But as all academics know, there's a lot of work from prior commitments that occurs during the grant application processes and some overlap with the grant project itself, if successful. And this shows some of the work that I was doing during my application and the fellowship. On to DC. This map shows in red all the Smithsonian museums, and the Smithsonian Institution is actually the world's largest museum, education and research complex with 21 museums, 14 education and research centres, and the National Zoo. It was founded in 1846 by an Englishman, James Smythson, as an establishment for the increase and diffusion of knowledge. I was appointed to 2 museums, primarily the National Museum of Natural History, but also the National Museum of African Art, which houses the Elliott Elizabeth Photographic Archives. I promised a slideshow to a lot of people. Here it comes. I arrived at the end of January in the snow and immediately walked 10 miles with a military guy who I met on the mall, and we walked at a fast pace on a circuit spanning Lincoln Memorial, the White House, and the Library of Congress. And this was a helpful reconnaissance, so he told me, of DC. So some of the sites included Lincoln Memorial, a statue of Kosciuszko or Kosciuszko for the Polish, I hope I've got that right, who Australia's highest mountain was named after, but he was also instrumental in the American Revolutionary War. And so you can see that statue here through the fence, which is around the White House. And the cranes on the right over the White House ballroom site. That was pretty much as close as I could get. This is the United States Congress on the left, and an installation in the National Museum of African American History and Culture, which was very soothing because it was like having tropical rainfall in an otherwise very dry climate. And on the right is the view of the outside of that building. So my daily commute, I navigated the metro, which is quite beautiful in DC, was fingerprinted at a small commercial printing office, was checked in at the Smithsonian and found my way to the Natural History Museum, And after a week of hesitation, made myself at home in this vacant office, which was very nice. In the Museum of Natural History, it is a complicated layout behind the scenes because there are 2 wings with 6 floors and there are fewer floors in the middle. So it's quite a feat to navigate around in the back spaces of the museum. And that museum alone has got 11 libraries. Each other museum has got its own library. So there's no shortage of libraries to visit. This is me in the anthropology library, which has very lovely, comfortable chairs. The middle one is the birds library, and on the right is the botany library. I also used other libraries to access additional items that fell outside the focus of the Natural History Museum. The Library of Congress, of course, is fantastic, and it was useful for accessing monographs of literary scholarship. And the photo on the right is a tree, one of over 3,000 donated to the US by Japan in 1912, with this one transplanted to the library grounds in 1922. And I'm smiling because Roger wanted me to find this tree, and he's long known that I did find it. So there it is. And the Library of Congress is simply a beautiful building. You have to show your physical passport and have a reading card issued before you can look at a book there. But once the system is understood, it becomes an extraordinary resource that helped me a great deal with my research. I also found additional texts at the Harvard's Dumbarton Oaks Library at Georgetown in DC. And I purposely took these photos with the lights off because it was the scariest library I've ever seen. But you can switch the lights on yourself and the shelves move automatically. It's truly wonderful. And outside are the magnificent gardens alongside a mansion donated by Robert and Mildred Bliss to Harvard University, which is all part of the same complex of Dumbarton Oaks. So I did other things while in the US, like witnessing these monks walking from Texas to DC for peace. I went to some live music and theatre performances and attended the Mother Tongue Film Festival. So these are the things that you can do in your spare time, which is enriches the experience. So I guess I'd better talk about the project, because I have, in my lifetime, witnessed loss and degradation of tropical rainforest. And this made me curious about how narratives play a role in this process. And for those perhaps online who are unfamiliar with the tropics, this is an example of the forest where those of us here live. And since 1988, this has been protected to an extent by registration as the Wet Tropics of Queensland World Heritage Area. And I say to an extent because feral animals and other pests don't abide by such boundaries. The Wet Tropics of Queensland World Heritage Area is a tiny fraction of Australia's land area, only 0.12%, yet it's highly biodiverse with 40% of Australia's birds, 30% of our marsupials, 58% of the bats, and 60% of our butterflies. It also has over 4,000 species of plants in the wider bioregion and contains living relics of the Gondwanan rainforest that covered Australia 50 to 100 million years ago. It's a World Heritage Area because it's globally significant and irreplaceable. Now, much of the clearing of tropical rainforest in North Queensland has occurred relatively recently. These maps show that about half the rainforest, particularly lowland forests, were cleared over a roughly 60-year period to 2017 to make way for agriculture, mostly sugarcane, bananas, mangoes, and dairy farming, and for urban development. Another inspiration for my research was this book by Elizabeth Chang, and she's a former professor at the University of Missouri. She studied British literature of the Victorian era to identify representations of exotic plants in fiction to illuminate a socio-cultural set of socio-cultural implications of a period of frantic colonial plant collecting throughout the British Empire. Now, she cites Keith Thomas, who wrote that in the year 1500, there were 200 cultivated plants in England, and by 1839, there were around 18,000. So that gives you a bit of an idea of the scale of this activity over those centuries. Another scholar of the representation of plants in British literature is Dr. Mary Bowden at the University of Delaware, who I was fortunate to meet during my fellowship. And I also met the awe-inspiring Professor Nicholas Burns, who needs no introduction to literary scholars. In response to Chang's work, though, I wanted to look at how plants in their original locations are represented in literature. Narratives or storytelling sheds light on human nature, relationships, and shapes knowledge and attitudes towards environmental issues. Stories are highly influential, and literary scholars are well placed to disentangle bias and fiction from what might otherwise be viewed as truth. Australian Ellis Rowan wrote a memoir called A Flower Hunter in Queensland and New Zealand, which was published in 1898. And Rowan was primarily a painter of watercolours, producing over 3,000 works in her lifetime, 4 of which are held in the Dumbarton Oaks library, and I was lucky enough to view those while I was there. But I'm most interested in her writing. She travelled through the rainforest in North Queensland here, where those of us in the room live, and she published in the United Kingdom at the tail end of an international era of travel writing. It was wonderful to have access to this original 1898 edition from the museum's botany library. And I also had access to 3 books on the botany of the United States written by American botanist Alice Lounsbury that Ellis Rowan illustrated. And the librarian at the Smithsonian, Robin Everly, was also extremely helpful in helping me track down an elusive quote by American environmental lawyer Gus Smyth and numerous other books. So in my application, I wrote that it was absolutely essential that I viewed an item unavailable anywhere else in the world, and it was this personal diary by Waldo Smith. With the help of archivist Tad Bennicott, I went to the archives at the Smithsonian, and there I opened the appropriate box and the diary appeared to be missing. Now, Tad reached into the depths and pulled out a very tiny item. And inside was a whole lot of unhelpful jottings. So that key to my application turned out to be completely useless. However, also in the box were a bunch of letters. And Waldo Smith was a prolific letter writer, especially to his benefactors, Mr. and Mrs. Braddon. And here, in his letters, he commits to travel writing while on his expedition to the Congo to study mites. And the way he conveys an effective experience of tropical rainforest sheds light on the persistence of types of imagery with time. Thankfully, his handwriting is easy to read, but there's also a number of typed letters and even draft letters like this one here. So despite the diary being less useful than hoped, the letters, which I'd not expected to find, proved to be valuable. And this is just to show that I'm glad we don't depend on itineraries like this anymore. So, of course, I had to visit the Coleman Rare Books Library, And it may or may not surprise you, but I had no intention of actually reading Stanley before I left Australia. However, I soon found myself looking at How I Found Livingstone, published in 1872, and In Darkest Africa, published in 1890, the latter being more useful for a comparative analysis with Ellis Rowan's memoir because it was published in the same decade. Now, you likely all know the history of colonialism, but these maps give a visual indication of the rapid colonisation of Africa by countries such as the United Kingdom, France, Portugal, and importantly for the Congo, Belgium. And this is roughly the period when the texts that I'm studying were published. So back to Stanley. He was an ambitious journalist who had a newspaper tracking his expedition experience. I'd like to say in real time, Roger, but it's it's not quite like today. But as he went, and a book contract to build on his fame established through finding Livingstone. In Darkest Africa, he writes of rainforest that he wants readers to get a real idea of what it is like. Now, travel writing never actually gives a real idea. It's known to tell us more about the person writing it than the place they're in. So we have to understand the writer and the historical and cultural context that to make sense of Stanley's real idea. And that context is evident in literature, but also by looking at photographs. And in fact, photographs taken around the same time in the Congo reinforce the interests of explorers and colonists. They are filled with photos of African peoples who they sought to study and exploit, agriculture, settlements, and the Congo River, which was instrumental to transportation. And these are virtually the only images of trees or rainforest, a massive tree that was felled and a path through a forest. And what's interesting about the path, and it's difficult to see here, is that several people are present. And there are people everywhere in photos of Africa. But interestingly, the textual descriptions of forest, as opposed to Stanley's descriptions of what he calls forest marching, the depictions of forest exclude people. And this is reinforced by the drawings that accompany the text. And it gives the impression of forests as untouched wilderness, which is a concept that remains problematic for Indigenous peoples today. These are some of the many books that I accessed at various libraries. And two of those shown here were found for me by librarian Henry Napitter. One was an extraordinary book by Fritz Anderson on European narratives about the Congo. And the second surprised me the most and is extremely helpful. It was a book called Blood River, written by a young man, Tim Butcher, and published in 2008. And this guy, he decided to retrace Stanley's journey, except without a mass of people carrying supplies. He went most of the time on the back of a motorbike. So his journey is different, but he retains Stanley's imagery of the forest. No doubt he wanted to make his journey resemble Stanley's in whatever way possible, but the effect is to reinforce Stanley's 19th century view of rainforest rather than creating some kind of alternative. So all the while, the Smithsonian Fellowships program provides a rich suite of social and professional development opportunities that I've labelled here as distractions, but they were essential for networking and learning more about the Smithsonian institution. So I saw the birds collected by President Theodore Roosevelt when he was a teenager there. These are the bison that had just arrived and were since positioned on either side of the steps of the museum on the mall side. And those weird looking gloves sticking out are at another facility. out of town that the Smithsonian has, but they're apparently for handling meteorites. So yeah, it's just a fun fact along the way. So I guess I better talk about the research article. The title is there. In the essay that I wrote in DC, I use a transnational framework to position Rowan's lesser-known writing within a broader history of exploration by comparing it with Stanley's memoir to enable new insights into Australian cultural history. I offer an interpretation of how tropical forest is represented in each work by examining what is revealed or omitted and the effective qualities of the text. And put another way, if Stanley can be viewed as the inspiration for the Kurtz character in Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, also published in that decade, then what inspiration does tropical rainforest, as depicted by Rowan and Stanley, offer to later writers? What character did Rowan and Stanley craft for tropical forest, and what does this mean today? How might their representations contribute to a contemporary Anglophone cultural construction of rainforest? I find evidence in Rowan and Stanley's writing of rainforest represented as dangerous, dark and foreboding, impenetrable and problematic, beautiful and exotic, and as I mentioned earlier, as untouched wilderness. I discuss how this imagery is constructed and how it persists or doesn't in later travel writing. I discuss the ambitions of the writers, the profitability of publication at that time, and the authority they gained through writing and the use of fiction to dramatise events. It's a long, as you can see, a long and intricate essay, but it is mostly done. Now, because academia is highly competitive space, especially for those of us who are precariously employed, I couldn't only write a 9,000-word essay in those 3 months. I also, as Roger said, edited a special issue on trees and forests for the American journal Antipodes, due for publication in July, and revised a co-authored article for a UK journal, Green Letters, on Aboriginal Australian perspectives of rainforest, due for publication in June, and other academic things that I'm required to do along the way. The Smithsonian journal article will be submitted to a Taylor and Francis journal in June, is my aim with that. You'll see I've got changed perspective in blue there, and we'll come back to that shortly. So there are a huge number of people to thank at the Smithsonian who made me feel welcome and supported my visit. And it was truly wonderful and highly productive experience. I especially want to mention Dr. Catherine Kim from QUT, who is another fellow from Queensland at the National Natural History Museum while I was there, and she was studying coral reefs. And I also would like to mention Rebecca Johnson, who's the former chief scientist at the Australian Museum and who's well established as the chief scientist at the Smithsonian's Natural History Museum. So these were the Australians. The other names were all people who were really, really important as well. So it's just a huge number of people that pull these programs together. So this is where I'm going to use this seminar to make a stand for early career researchers. This is part of my changed perspective. At present in the university sector, it feels like the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. And early career researchers have precarious and often fractional employment and, like a lot of other academics, no conference funding. But this has a disproportionately negative impact on early career researchers. And our diversity and inclusion training points to how this type of one-size-fits-all approach to staff employment conditions ignores the career context of ECRs and puts them relative to other academic staff at a disadvantage. But what I discovered in the US was some inspiration. John F. Kennedy, he sought to make the world a better place. And instead of the strong doing what they can, the weak suffering what they must, JFK sought a world where the strong are just and the weak secure. And this is what institutions in Australia and around the world need to strive towards, I think, to support early career researchers. Now, in closing, a reminder that we're not looking after our environment. Nature is declining. As Jennifer Hamilton, Emily Potter, and Killian Quigley noted in a 2024 article, I'm quoting them now, word and world are always related, but the relationship between the two is enduringly complicated. So this seminar has demonstrated an interplay of eco-criticism, real-world issues, and storytelling. Thank you again to the Queensland Government, James Cook University, the Roderick Centre for Australian Literature and Creative Writing, and the Smithsonian Institute for supporting my research. And thanks to all of you here and online for your time. So I'm happy to hear any questions and comments. Thank you.
I'm just going to bring up the chat so Elizabeth can see the chat for any comments that are coming online. So Anita's already there. Congratulations, Elizabeth. But I might take the Cairns because we're here in Cairns. I might just take the Cairns crowd first and ask if there's any questions or comments or anything that you might like to ask Elizabeth at this stage. And Tim, just because we're actually using the microphone on the computer here, you might just have to speak up a little bit, everyone here in Cairns.
Thanks, Elizabeth, and I really like the topic you're researching. From an earlier colonial point of view, I'm just wondering, how helpful is someone like Joseph Banks, for instance, who was on the first Cook expedition and spent time in North Queensland, who was very determined to study the natural history and the plants, and took his reports back to the UK. Was he very helpful, or could he be
helpful to who? To researchers?
We need to.
The question.
Roger, Elizabeth, please repeat.
I'll repeat the question. The question is, Joseph Banks, when he came to North Queensland collecting plants and things, how helpful was he? And I'm just asking Tim, helpful to who? To research?
Describing a tropical...
But helpful to researchers or to the UK colonial or...
how helpful is he
botanist?
to words? Was he helpful in describing tropical rainforests, for instance?
Yeah, so I'll just answer how helpful Joseph Banks was. I'll just say that there's a lot of people and a lot of writing that can be researched. So it's just purely for the sake of a short project, which is 3 months, that I had to really contain it to these two works. There's a lot involved in just positioning those two works amidst a whole lot of literary scholarship, particularly once you bring Stanley into it, because there's been a lot written about him in all sorts of ways. So yeah, so it's hard for me to answer that, but this research will certainly not exclude people who want to then do some further study of his works. Yeah. So there's scope, anybody, a call out if anyone wants to do some more adjacent research. Yeah.
So I'm just going to stop sharing so we can see the, everyone online and the crowd in Townsville, so we can ask for any more questions from in the room here in Cairns. Mike Wood has his virtual hand up. So Mike, turn on your microphone and
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Great. Look, I was just wondering, and maybe a little bit off topic, but one of the things about rainforest is that you mentioned was that there weren't very many people in the accounts you were reading or the imagery. I'm not sure. But I was thinking, well, look, the people in the rainforest tend to be very small, right?
Well,
As
they
you
knew they were
know,
there.
here, they're all pygmies, quote Tyndale, and in PNG, they're pygmies or smaller, right? So I was just wondering, in Africa, I assume there are somewhat similar notions of size, right? So just is there a unique characteristic that you're getting from your comparison on the people front?
Let me just say, this is
Yeah, I know you weren't really talking about that topic, but I find it interesting that everywhere you go, there are people that are small, but there are also small spirit people too. But that's another topic.
Well, that's a great question. Thanks, Michael, for asking that. And just for everyone else there, Mike is a anthropologist, so of course interested in the people, as were a lot of the colonial explorers. However, in their writing, as I said, they well knew that there were people everywhere. They well knew it. However, when they have their key blocks of text to describe rainforest, they don't include them. And that is because they want to be the hero, I guess, and explain how hard and difficult it was for them in that environment, perhaps, or how blissful and like Eden it was, whichever perspective they are choosing to convey at that time. So it's interesting. And so no, I don't go into any commentary on the people as such, except to point out that they are excluded. And in the drawings which accompany those particular bits of text, which I think I had in my presentation, there are no people in those drawings either. So it's just a fascinating, interesting thing to think about and discuss. And so I'm being a good literary scholar. I'm just sticking to the text before me, and as the evidence that I'm interpreting and trying to understand.
So there is a literary question in the chat from Linda Duran. How has it been changing people's writing related to nature? Have you seen more awareness, or is it still descriptive? And that is in terms of literature, not so much the scientific articles.
Yeah, let me say that these writing by these two people was not descriptive. I wouldn't term it that way, because they were very passionate and dramatic and fictionalizing and making it very exciting. So it was, I would say, yeah, very creative nonfiction. And there's certainly players in that landscape themselves and that's what gives it an emotional feeling as well. But I did notice, looking at later travel writing, the things that I did look at was, like I said, that one book where the fellow kept a similar way of conveying it. But then other travel writers, for example, botanists from the Smithsonian went on and more recent ventures into tropical forest, and it was quite different in terms of there was no judgment, you could say. He didn't have the same cultural baggage that he brought with him to be disparaging and see it as problematic or dark or ominous or whatever. He was clearly someone in more recent times who just found it all wonderful, but was also, because of scientific training, very pragmatic and that came through in how he wrote. So it is very different, the writing now, and it very much depends on the purpose of writing of the writer as to how they approach it and what it does. So yeah, thanks for that question. I hope that gives you some insight.
Thanks, Linda. Melissa has a question in the room here in Cairns, and then Rafaela.
Yeah, thank you, and thanks for a wonderful presentation. As you just brought up then, the later travel writing, so I can see there's a challenge by looking back to the historical writing, because you know who wrote the history gets to tell the story, and so yeah, I'm wondering if now as more of those First Nation people have become anthropologists or writing, are there any Indigenous writings of that time, even if it's reflecting backwards?
Yeah, well, I can't answer that question actually, because I haven't gone down that track. However, just the paper that I have coming out in a week's time or whenever it comes out is one where I collaborated with an elder from here, and to have, and he was very generous to give a perspective of the issues that Indigenous people have today in response to some migrant writing done in this place here. So yeah, so if you're interested in that, that will be just around the corner in the context of North Queensland. But yeah, it's a great question, and rest assured that the people who wrote the history back then have been interrogated by a vast universe of scholars. So they, that history is not just swallowed. It's been teased apart and investigated and challenged and all of those things for a long time. But yeah, so sorry, I can't answer the question about in Africa, but there will be definitely a lot of African literature to be read, and I just encourage everyone to seek that out and find it when, in due course, when this article is published. So there's always more work to be done. Yes, thanks. Yeah.
Rafaela.
I was wondering whether the whole experience or in the research itself, whether it's inspired any creative writing.
It did, and I have done it.
Sorry, can you repeat, please?
Oh, sorry. The question was, has the whole experience inspired any creative writing from me? And I said, yes, it has, and it has been done. So, yeah, yes is the answer to that. So I have written a short piece of creative nonfiction, in which I used some of that experience of being in the US. But that is another, that's a whole other thing. It's unrelated to this particular project and mission. It's just a side benefit for those of you who want to apply for a Queensland-Smithsonian Fellowship. There are many. Yeah, there's a lot of inspiration.
I'm looking around the room here in Cairns for any hands or curious looks. I'm also looking for virtual curious looks from
Townsville,
anyone.
we've got a question or comment, yeah?
Yes, please.
Yeah, thanks for that, Elizabeth. It was fantastic. As always, it's been good to see your journey over to the America and working on all that project. Do you know the literature on the excursions to the Congo River and into the Belgian jungle? If there's, how did they refer to the places they went to? Did they use local names, or did they use created European names to name where they went?
Yeah, I think it was a combination actually. And, to be honest with you, it's just a intellectual nightmare trying to chart where they went, because a whole lot of names of places are not on the current maps as well. So yeah, that's something that the historians thankfully can disentangle and probably already have. But yeah, that's yeah, that was, thanks for asking that question, because yeah, so it's a combination of colonial names. Of course, there's Stanley Falls as a classic example. But there are also I'm presuming they sound very African names for villages and places as well. But then now looking at these things, there's also that period of time where change occurs as well. So it's not an easy landscape if you want to be following in the footsteps of these people. Even the 1950s Smithsonian expeditions, not easy to follow in that way. So yeah, thankfully for this particular article, I don't need to do that work.
Right, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Danny.
Look, thank you. That was an amazing presentation, very thorough, and I loved the link between actually showing the context of the work and the difficulty of being in ECR and pushing ahead and doing it. I'm just wondering, I guess there is a bit of a question, has this opened up? I mean, a lot, the output's amazing and there seem to be more lined up, but new perspectives, new opportunities for you that you hadn't anticipated?
Yeah, thanks, Ines. That's a great question. Yeah, it has, because while I'm there, of course, I try to meet with all sorts of people, and one of them in particular was the head of the Smithsonian Press publishing house. And so, yeah, that as a result of this, there is a 5-year window, you could say, to put in a proposal for some sort of academic book publication. Now, whether they would accept it is another thing, but there are things like that. That's just one example, I suppose, of where it opens doors if you look for those doors. And I have to say that most of the fellows, there were about 30 fellows at the museum while I was there, and they were pretty much all scientists and all in a different section. I was specifically in libraries and archives, and so it was it's not quite so simple to develop collaborations with other fellows, for example, just because I was from a different field. But who knows? We did get to know each other, and we have connected on LinkedIn, and things can flow from that. But just making sure that I stepped out and found some literary scholars to talk with was absolutely amazing. And there were other bits and pieces of advice from those people. So particularly, I think Mary Bowden, I'd like to work with her down the track.
If I might take the opportunity to start wrapping up, I've been thinking about that tree, Elizabeth, and as a way of wrapping up, I'll explain to you a little bit about the story of the tree. I was at the Library of Congress about a decade ago doing research, and at the same, there was snow then as well, but the tree had this light dusting of snow on it, and I was intrigued by its age and the prop that was under there holding it up. And I've always been concerned that it was going to fall over and it wouldn't be there. And so it was really good to be able to see that the tree is still there, but really interesting to see that there's a whole other set of props holding that tree up. I learned a bit. I'm going to get you to retell the history of those trees for me a bit later. But there's a metaphor in that for the literary mindedness of us all, that's props and the support of that tree that has a significant natural existence, but also a really cultural importance. And I think there's a part of that resonates for me in what Elizabeth has presented to us today, and I'll continue to think about it and hopefully visit that tree myself some years from now, and it'll still be there. So that was my way of wrapping up, but also waiting for any questions to come on the chat, and there is none. So going once, going twice. All that's left is to thank Elizabeth for a really wonderful presentation and for giving us lots to think about.